Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to call the Lobster Board meeting to order. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pat Kelleher. I am the chair of the American Lobster Board. We're a couple minutes behind schedule. We've got a couple topics that may need a little additional time today. And I do have several members of the public that have traveled a long way that I'm sure are going to want to speak during some of the topics where motions potentially are going to be made. Before we get to the meat of the agenda, do we have any objections to what the agenda is? Do we get approval of the agenda? Any modifications need to be made? Seeing none, approval of the proceedings from April 2024. Everybody have an opportunity to review those. Any additions, changes needed? Seeing none, we'll approve those minutes by consent. Public comment. Is there anybody from the public that would like to speak on items that are not on the agenda? Again, items that are not on the agenda. So anything not related to addendum 27 or 30. Not seeing any members of the public who want to speak. Great. We're going to go right to Jeff Kipp, who's got a quick update on the benchmark stock assessment. Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just be giving a brief update on the ongoing benchmark assessment for Lobster. Just to touch on the assessment timeline milestones that we've worked through so far. We did have a data workshop back in February of this year, and that was virtual, working through review of our available data sets and identifying data tasks. We did just recently complete our first assessment workshop a couple of weeks ago in New Bedford. We have had several periodic webinars and a number of biweekly modeler meetings between these workshops, and we'll continue with those as needed moving forward in the process. Just to touch on the topics that were covered at that first assessment workshop, we reviewed development of continuity models, got into growth modeling and environmental driver data and analyses. We then talked about advancements to the continuity models that we'll be working on from this point forward, and also some alternative index of abundance development. We did review the remaining timeline with that workload in mind, and the SAS did express some concern with that timeline. There was also a couple of challenges we've run into so far. We've had slow access to confidential data for some external collaborators that we're working with outside of the stock assessment subcommittee. And also it was noted that 2023 data, which is the terminal year of this assessment, will not be complete until around the time of our tentatively scheduled final workshop later this fall. So the SAS is recommending extending the assessment timeline one commission meeting cycle. And we just note that this will sync the timeline if we do extend with the completion of the 2020 benchmark assessment, which was presented to the board at the 2020 annual meeting in October. So the items up on the screen in black text here show the remaining milestones for our assessment timeline. The dates crossed out are the originally scheduled dates for these remaining timelines, and the text in red is what the SAS is proposing for the extended timeline to complete the assessment. So we would have an assessment, a final assessment workshop, and we're proposing shifting that to February of next year, with the peer review workshop shifted to August of next year, and then plans to present the assessment and peer review reports to the board at the annual meeting in October of next year. So that concludes my update. So looking for if there's any concerns or comments on that proposed shift to the timeline, and just any questions on the assessment update in general.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Back to the board. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Jeff, or any concerns about that delay? Seeing one hand. Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No concern. Jeff, I was just wondering, and you might not be able to answer this, but just wondering if you could expand a little bit on, I'm curious as to what the data issues were. And so maybe to tailor your answer. I guess what I'd be most interested in, is there something we can fix there so it doesn't happen again? Or was it was just the thing and you had to work through it?
Yeah, I don't know that there's something there that we can fix. It was sort of a unique situation where we were working with some external folks to get access to commercial data, and that's to develop some socioeconomic indicators that we're hoping to include to advance the set of model-free indicators that we developed in the assessment to include more of those socioeconomic aspects. And just with those folks not being official members of the stock assessment subcommittee, getting that confidential data access was a challenge. A note that came along from that was that they were funded to do that work through Sea Grant, and also to help with the assessment as part of that funding. And that funding mechanism is what allowed for that access to those data.
Thank you. Renee?
Yeah, just to follow up on exactly that point, Jeff, I wrote that down as something that we run into that a lot with our states and confidentiality regulations. I'm wondering if the future, I know they were funded through Sea Grant, but if there's a way to contract them through ASMFC. I know that a number of states have regulations on the books where that would be an easy check mark for access versus somebody who's from an external or academic agency.
Thanks, Renee. That's a good suggestion. Anybody else on board for questions for Jeff? Seeing none, I mean, the delay is what the delay is. I think we need to make sure that we're getting through that in a way that gives us the best results at the end of the time period. So seeing no other concerns, let's move right along in the agenda. Thanks for that, Jeff. Now we're going to go to agenda item number 5, which is a plan development team report on conservation measures for lobsters for area 2 and 3. And we're going to go to Caitlin Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to go over the report developed by the Lobster Plan Development Team, PDT, in response to its task from the board. And this topic is related to the 2023 NOAA interim rule to implement the measures from Addenda 21 and 22. Those 2 addenda were approved in 2013 and included the aggregate ownership caps in LCMAs 2 and 3 and maximum trap cap reductions in LCMA 3. At that time, those measures were intended to scale the southern New England fishery to the size of the stock, which had been found depleted in the previous stock assessment. But because the federal rule to implement those measures was not completed until 2023, there were 10 years between the approval of the original addenda and the federal implementation. And so because of that gap, the Lobster Board, as well as industry members, had expressed concerns that there were some significant changes in the fishery during that 10-year time period. The board thought these changes should be investigated further. So in January, it tasked the PDT with reviewing the conservation measures originally set in Addenda 21 and 22 and making recommendations for alternate measures to achieve those reductions, inclusive of recommendations from the lobster conservation management teams, or LCMTs. And so the board received a preliminary report from the PDT at the spring meeting, and today I'll go through the final PDT report. So the PDT report has a lot of information in it, and I'm going to have to move fairly quickly through them. But the first part of the report contains analyses of the changes that have occurred in southern New England since 2013. And this includes changes in permits issued, trap allocations, maximum traps fished, latent traps, trips and landings, and the development of the Jonah crab fishery. The PDT also considered the input provided by the Area 2 and 3 LCMTs and provided some conclusions and possible management responses for board consideration. So the board received a summary of the LCMT 2 meeting at its May meeting, but the LCMT 3 meeting took place in June. So to start us off, I'm going to pass it over to Dan McKiernan to give a summary of that meeting.
Thank you, Caitlin. The LCMT 3 had not met in a number of years, and the reason for the delay from the possible April timeline to the summer was we had to reconstitute the Area 3 LCMT, which we did, working with the other state directors who had vessels fishing within their state in Area 3. We had a meeting and 4 members and 1 alternate attended. As was mentioned, the purpose of the meeting is to provide guidance and insights to the PDT as they were undergoing their work, which was very challenging because the lobster fishery has not been well documented historically because of the uneven requirements for our catch reports, and also the fact that these statistical areas tend to be so large, it's hard to parse the effort in the landings to one stock unit or the other. And so, what the PDT heard from the participating members of the LCMT was to, and as you just mentioned, take a strong look at the movement of these permits. We did see and you're going to be showing this shortly, but just to briefly sort of forecast it, movement of the permits from the west to the east or from the south to the north. The trend toward Jonah crab trapping that, even though you're seeing fishing effort, it's not on lobster, it's on Jonah crabs. And also the consolidation that's occurred in the 10 to 12 years since those other addendums, 21 and 22, were instituted, and the water was kind of passed under the bridge in terms of achieving those goals because of the consolidation. So I think the results you're going to show reflect that which the members suggested the PDT examine. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dan. So moving back to the PDT report, I'll start by going through the analyses the PDT put together. And I want to note here at the beginning that the PDT used state and federal data where possible to give the most complete picture they could. Available state and federal data sets did not always align, and some data were not available, and that is specified in the report in those cases. The first thing the PDT looked at is changes in the number of permits issued by state for areas 2 and 3 using publicly available federal permit data. And this table is showing the permits issued by state for area 2. And you can see the total number of federal LCMA2 permits has decreased substantially between 2014 and 2013 across all of the states. This next table shows the federal data for LCMA3 federal permits issued to vessels that also has steadily decreased from 105 permits in 2014 to 76 in 2023. And most states have seen a decrease in the number of LCMA vessels except New Hampshire. The PDT also looked at state level data for Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And this figure shows a declining trend in active permits landing in Massachusetts between 2010 and 2022 for both LCMAs 2 and 3. So Area 2 is the blue line and Area 3 is the orange line. And just a quick note on some of these figures, I did add that vertical dashed line at the 2013 year, so you can focus on changes after that point. The same declining pattern is showing in the Rhode Island data, but declines in the number of active permits is more pronounced in LCMA2 than LCMA3. Moving on to changes in trap allocations, the PDT looked at allocations for LMA2 and 3 permit holders. And as a note, we only had data since 2015 for this time series because of missing data from Rhode Island for 2012 through 2014. So this figure shows that in Area 2, allocations were reduced by 25% in 2016, and then an additional 5% each year between 2017 and 2021. So overall, between 2015 and 2023, there was a 45.4% reduction in the combined state and federal LCMA2 allocation. And then for federal Area 3 allocation data, they reflect the 5% per year reduction in allocations that occurred over the 2016 to 2020 time period. The data show a 20.2% reduction in the allocation from 2013 to 2023. And the PDT did note that these annual totals do not account for any allocation that's held on a permit that was in certification of permit history, or CPH, for a given year. Next, the PDT looked at the maximum number of traps reported fished each year between 2013 and 2022 using data reported to NOAA Fisheries, as well as Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So for LCMA 2, these data show a decline over the past 10 years with a 39% reduction in traps fished. And unlike the Area 3 Area 3's trap allocations, the maximum traps fished in LCMA 3 have been pretty stable over the last 10 years with only a 4.3 reduction from 2013 to 2022. And then to assess the number of latent traps in each area, the PDT compared allocated traps and maximum traps fished. So for Area 2, this comparison covers the years 2015 to 2022 based on the available data. And over that time period, latent traps in Area 2 were reduced by 54%. In Area 3, there was a 64% reduction in latent traps from 2013 to 2022, with the lowest number occurring in 2020. And again, these do not include permits that are in certification of permit history. So those permits could have latent traps associated with them that are not accounted for here. The PDT also wanted to investigate the idea that fishing effort in LMA 3, which spans both lobster stocks, could have shifted from southern New England to the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank stock. So looking at the number of trips in each stock area, which are shown by the columns, you can see that they were fairly evenly distributed earlier in the time series, but then overall numbers of trips in southern New England has declined, while the number of trips occurring in the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank stock has been more stable. And then looking at the Area 3 landings from each stock area, we see that they have been skewed towards the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank stock area across the time series, but the percent of total landings from the southern New England stock has shifted from approximately 30% of the total to less than 10%. And a caveat with this analysis is that before April 1st, 2024, federal lobster-only permit holders were not required to submit vessel trip reports. So federal data on activity and landings here is not comprehensive. The PDT wanted to get an idea of how representative the data are of the LMA 3 fleet. So they looked at the percent of permit holders that did have a reporting requirement throughout the time series. And they found that on average, about 80% of the vessels had a federal reporting requirement across that time series. Next, hearing that input from the LCMTs about the Jonah crab fishery playing a role in the changes in the lobster fishery, the PDT examined data on Jonah crab landings and fishing effort. There's several important caveats to this analysis. So first, the mixed crustacean nature of this fishery makes it difficult to determine whether a fishing trip should be considered directed effort for Jonah crab or not. So based on input from the LCMT 3 June meeting, trips where Jonah crab landings were 80% or greater of the total landings of Jonah crab and lobster were classified as directed Jonah crab trips. So note that that method that's used to determine what direct versus indirect trips are would definitely impact this analysis. And then second, Jonah crab, the fisheries have heavily influenced by the market. So that has been variable over the last several years. And this is something that was supported by the LCMT's comments, and it makes it difficult to understand what is causing some of the trends we see in the Jonah crab fishery. That said, the PDT analysis shows the majority of Jonah crab landings are caught in the southern New England lobster stock area, and it's been like that since 2013. The percent of Jonah crab landings that come from southern New England versus the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank lobster stock hasn't varied by much, but it does show a slightly decreasing trend since 2013. And the number of trap pot fishing trips landing any quantity of Jonah crab from the southern New England stock area, which is shown by the blue line at the bottom, increased from 2010 to around 2018, followed by a decline in the number of trips landing Jonah crab. And the red line at the top shows the number of trap pot fishing trips landing any quantity of Jonah crab from the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank lobster stock area. And as you can see, that has been a lot more variable. And then here we're looking at the number of directed Jonah crab trips, which again was defined as trips where Jonah crab comprised 80% or more of the total combined landings. So for Southern New England, directed trips were highest from 2014 to 2018, but have been decreasing since then. And then the number of directed Jonah crab trips in the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank stock area has been variable, but since 2013, we see an increase and then a decrease. And the PDT noted that there isn't really a clear relationship between the decline in the Southern New England area and the changes in effort and catch in the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank stock area in the most recent years, but that could be due to those market factors that could also be driving Jonah crab effort. So the part of the PDT task to consider input from the LCMTs was accounted for, and as you've heard, some of these analyses took those LCMT's advice into consideration. Additionally, the PDT responded to a few things raised at the LCMT meetings. First, the LCMT2 members talked about how in the last few years, federal lobster permits have frequently been sold as part of other transactions that have resulted in those permits leaving the Area 2 fishery altogether. And based on the PDT's analyses, they agree that this trend is reflected in the data. And then the LCMTs also talked about the control date that was in the NOAA interim rule, which was May 1st, 2022. And they recommended changing it to a future date or removing it. And the PDT commented on this, saying that if a future control date were put in place, that might cause some speculation and an increase in effort if harvesters were to attempt to purchase more traps in advance to bolster their allocations. And if the board doesn't want to pursue ownership caps as part of its management strategy for Area 2 and 3, then a new control date would not be needed. And then at the Area 3 meeting, it was stated that the Southern New England fishery has scaled itself back since 2013, with reduced effort also shifting east and moving to the Jonah crab fishery. And that they mentioned that logbook data would be able to show these shifts. The PDT didn't have access to logbook data for this analysis, but they agree it could be helpful to look at them, and specifically looking at the number of trap hauls by stock area over time. The PDT also agreed with the LCMTs that it does seem there's been a shift in effort and landings to the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank portion of LMA 3. The PDT discussed some possible approaches that the board could consider if it wishes to reduce exploitation of the Southern New England stock. However, the PDT did not really have recommendations on measures that could directly reduce the size of the fishery, which was the intent of Addenda 21 and 22. And as the analyses show, it appears that the size of the Southern New England fishery has already been reduced despite the rules from Addendum 21 and 22 not being implemented federally. The options the PDT discussed for reducing exploitation of the stock were seasonal and spatial closures, V-notching, output controls like trip limits or quotas, and reducing latent effort. And the PDT noted that these measures have been discussed by the board previously, and that there have been various concerns with them, and those are discussed in Addendum 17, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But regarding the closures, the PDT noted they could reduce landings during high exploitation periods, but the industry does rely heavily on those periods. And then spatial closures may help, but we can't predict if gear would just be then moved outside of a closure area. And then for V-notching, it's been discussed to protect reproductive females, but there have been concerns raised by the TC about further skewing the sex ratio of the Southern New England stock, as well as disease and increased regulatory discards. Trip limits and quota management in the lobster fisheries have historically been met with opposition because of the logistical difficulties in implementing and enforcing them. The PDT noted that trip limits could essentially nullify the current trap allocation system, and also that the number of trips could increase to make up for lost catch per trip. Quotas for the lobster fishery would obviously require drastic administrative changes, and probably it would have to impact the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank fishery as well. And then the last bullet here focuses on ways to further reduce latent effort to prevent it from becoming active in the future. However, it was noted that this would be unlikely to improve the stock from current conditions. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Not seeing any questions for Caitlin. Next steps. Let's look to Caitlin and Tony for Dave Borden.
Yeah, I have a comment, Mr. Chairman, if it's all right at this time. The PDT, I think, did a fine job and should be commended for the report. There are a couple of aspects that I agree with. They commented on the need to look at trap balls, and I think that's kind of critical given the changes in the fishery. If the PDT has the data available, and I'm not saying that they do, but if they do, and they can look at trap holes in the southern New England portion of stock, they're going to show a much more pronounced decrease than has been reflected in the report, because what is happening is people are increasing their set over time. And so the trap holes have gone down. The opposite is taking place on the Georges Bank portion of the stock where the trap holes are increasing. And that I'm just using my knowledge from my prior position with AOLA. And so that, I think that's something to look at. And on the issue of the committees, the Area 3 committee and Area 2 committee, the Area 2 committee, I think, has made a lot of progress at 2 meetings that were held in terms of kind of refining their positions. I think possibly if they met one more time, they could submit a written report that kind of summarizes those findings. I've listened to both of those discussions, I would point out. Area 3 is kind of a different group. I think that the PDT work really has to kind of progress on this if they're going to look at trap balls. And then after that's done, maybe the Area 3 group should meet again and look at the results and see if they have recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Dan McKernan.
Yeah, I agree with David. Great job by the PDT. I'd also like to point out, since this board voted in 2013 on the measures, a lot has changed in southern New England. Today, the fishery faces offshore wind development and all the displacement that we expect to see, and among all the Mass Rhode Island wind areas, and also a 3-month closure for right whales south of the islands. So, you know, I think when we enacted these rules a decade ago, it was between us, the fishermen, and the lobsters. And now you've got all these other forces that are affecting the industry's ability to make a living. And I think that needs to be factored in going forward. But I do agree with David. I think each of the LCMTs should be given an opportunity to look at the results. To David's point, I think there was some interest on the part of the Area 2 folks to maybe have a cap on the number of permits. So we should give them a chance to come back. The thing about Area 2 is a lot of those vessels have state permits as well, and our states have an owner-operator rule, so it kind of keeps the number or the scale of fleets that would be created down to a low level. But I would support reconvening each of those 2 groups for purposes of reviewing this report.
Great, thanks, Dan. Anybody else on this topic? So it seems like we've got some additional work to do with the LCMT. Oh, Caitlin has her hand. Go ahead.
I did just want to ask a clarifying question from David on looking at the trap halls. So we are in the middle of the lobster stock assessment, and that is something we could do through that process. So I want to get a sense of the urgency of that analysis and if we need to do that now or if doing it through the stock assessment process would be satisfactory.
If you want me to respond,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman. I think the Area 2 folks were so close to concluding their position, they could probably meet now. I think the Area 3 people have a longer road to get to a discussion. So if I could suggest anything, I would say do the Area 2 meeting and then let some of this rest of this work develop, and then have the Area 3 folks meet. Thank you.
I think what Caitlin's looking for though is, do you want to have, when do you want that data? Is the data on the trap analysis, is it all right coming out of the PDT, through the assessment process in October? Or do you want that information ahead of time?
October would be fine.
Okay.
If they were to meet between now and then, that's fine.
2020, that's 2025.
You mean the assessment?
Yeah. Not this bird season, next bird season.
Yeah, next year. There may be some benefit in having them meet before then. Thank you.
Question to you, David. Will this trap analysis aid in the board's decision on whether or not you would want to take further action or not? Or is it just an informative piece of information, just trying to manage the state staff's time and the work that they're trying to get done in the assessment, noting that they had to delay the assessment?
As far as Area 2, I think that might be a recommendation you could just eventually put on the table, and at the appropriate time include it in a subsequent addendum. I don't think it's time critical to do it. I've said that a couple of times.
Yeah. What I was going to suggest is, there seems to be consensus on the LCMTs to need to meet again, have that meeting, review what the PDT has done to date, see if additional analysis is needed after that time, and what the time frame should be based on those conversations. That work? Excellent. Okay. Good on your end. Okay. Anything else for Caitlin on these reports? Tony?
I just want to state that, so we, at this time, we have asked NOAA Fisheries to withdraw on the measures in the addendum, and that is holding. We did ask for exceptions for the transfers of multi-LCMA trap allocations, and we have asked those to continue to move forward. And until this board takes up anything else, then that stands. And the only thing that NOAA would be moving forward is that multi-LCMA trap allocation when they can.
Yeah, I don't think anything more is needed until we get through that process, right? Okay. Everybody in agreement there? Great. Okay. Nothing else from you, Caitlin? So, all right, well, let's move right along. Item number 6 is a report on the Colby College economic analysis of the lobster gauge increase. If you recall, through the addendum 27 process, and then at the last meeting, we had a lot of comments on the economics of the issues that we're dealing with. Economic analysis is not something we normally do, but we did receive a letter based on some work that was done in Maine. We've asked Amanda Lindsay to look at that information. So I think we have her, we phoned in a friend here, she's online. Amanda, if you can hear me, the floor.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Great, the floor is yours, Amanda.
Thank you. And I think I don't have control over the screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so I'll just say next when when I need the next slide moved. Okay, so obviously I am not Michael Donahue from Colby College. I am a different economist. I didn't have anything to do with that analysis that he did in April, but it is related to my area of expertise. And so I was asked to provide a little bit of context and maybe answer questions about the analysis that he did. Can you go to the next slide? Just because I'm new here, I just wanted to give you a little bit of my background. I have a degree in agricultural and resource economics, and in particular, my research focus is bioeconomic modeling and specifically looking at marine fisheries management policies. So I feel like I'm pretty well versed in what I need to know to kind of evaluate what he did. I'm new to Maine, but I spent the past year learning a lot about the lobster fishery in Maine. And so everything I'm talking about is really just focused on the perspective of that management area 1 and Maine lobster fisheries. I'm gonna run through some highlights for the policy analysis performed by Professor Donahue, but I also want to take a few moments to comment on analysis done by the technical committee so I can help kind of contextualize the results. And I just have a few thoughts that I want to leave you with today. Next. I'm sure we all know, but I just want to make very clear that what we're looking at in particular is what would the economic impact be of increasing the minimum carpus gauge length for Maine lobsters. To my understanding, this would be done over 2 stages. And the reason why it's such a big deal is DMR data suggests that a very large proportion of Maine's recent harvest would fall in this soon to be illegal range. And yeah, so the big question is, how is this going to affect our Maine lobster fishery? Next. So why did Michael Donahue provide this analysis? In 2016, he was involved with a bigger project. It's called the Dollars to Lobster project. There's several publicly available presentations and documents that I looked over after I was asked to kind of review his letter that he wrote. And that research really focused on the contribution of Maine dealers and buyers to the Maine economy. Both that previous analysis and this more recent one use this in-plan modeling software. If you've never heard of this before, it's an extremely common and standard modeling software used for economic analysis. It's a type of general equilibrium modeling, and the software comes equipped with the best and updated federal and state data sets that are needed to kind of parameterize the model. However, there are features of the software that allow users to enter additional information as needed. So in his previous 2016 work, Michael Donahue, with a team of researchers, collected a bunch of data from dealers in Maine and then used that to popularize his model. That was kind of a different model to my understanding of his letter, and this one that he performed in April was really focusing on the harvesters and upstream enterprises. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. Next. This is kind of a pretty crude cartoon. Economists typically don't use diagrams like this, but this is kind of like the way that I explain how this modeling process works to kind of my non-economist colleagues. So when you're doing this modeling software, you have to define the boundaries or the scope of your model. So in this case, we would have had a model of the Maine economy. Because we're interested in this fisheries policy, we have to explicitly make sure we have identified the number of harvesters, maybe the amount of capital that they are operating with, the relevant upstream enterprises, which are the input suppliers, and downstream enterprises as well. But of course, Maine is more than just a lobster fishery, so the model also kind of represents all other economic sectors and households and governments. These green and blue arrows I use to represent the flow of goods and services and money. And so a researcher will go into the software program and create a model that is in what we call equilibrium. So it's kind of a system at rest. Next. Then the researcher will introduce a policy shock. So that policy shock is used to kind of mimic or represent what the direct impact of a policy would be. And so in this second image, I've indicated that these 2 arrows leaving the harvesters are now red and they're smaller to represent his assumption that Addendum 27 would lead to a 10% reduction in landings value. So he introduces that shock to the system. and he lets a new equilibrium be found next. And so you have this before picture of the economy and you have an after picture of the economy. And comparing this before and after is how an economist would estimate the economic impact. So in his report, he identifies direct, indirect, and total economic impacts. And so that led him to his conclusion that this would have approximately a $60 million impact on the Maine economy. Next. So the letter was brief. I believe it was 2 pages, and it was very clearly a quick analysis. I think he did a really excellent job identifying all of the caveats to his study, and I just wanted to point a couple of them out, which I think are really, really salient. So given how this modeling process works, the assumption that the addendum 27 would reduce landing values by 10% is an assumption. He does not know if that number is the correct number. It could be greater, it could be smaller, but it's the assumption that he makes. And contingent on that being approximately true, then you can rely on those following results of what that would translate to in total effect. A few features about the model: it's a very theoretical model. It uses the best available data, but of course it could be more precisely updated to reflect current market conditions. He made a note in his memo that he focuses on harvesters and upstream and not the downstream enterprises because he doesn't believe the 2016 data he collected previously reflect current market conditions. The modeling framework that he uses doesn't explicitly model the fish stock or the behavior of the fishermen. So the fishermen could be changing their location or intensity or soak times or what have you in response to the policy, which his framework isn't set up to kind of model. And he also does not include the Canadian harvesters, which is important because they're drawing from, at least in part, some of the same stock. They compete in the same market and are subject to different regulations. So that could have big implications to the market conditions the Maine lobster fishery is going to face after Addendum 27 is implemented. And the final point, he doesn't really mention this, but I believe it's important to emphasize that his methodology is what I would call a static model. It's using snapshots of the economy in order to make the assessment. And so we don't know how long it would take for the stock or the economy to recover because it's just, the model isn't designed to answer those types of questions. Next. I think it's important, since I just had all these like really critical comments about his analysis, to put it in context of something that was provided for me in the draft document for the board discussions. This is particularly related to Appendix B, which was an analysis provided by the technical committee. I read through that as well to kind of help me understand how it compares to the work that Professor Donahue did. And I thought they were both very interesting. They seem like very rigorous. I mean, standard procedures were followed, etc. In their report for this Management Area 1, the researchers predicted a decline in the number of individuals, but an increase in the harvested weight after the Addendum 27 goes into effect. And I think it's really important to point out that that does not clearly tell us what the effect of landing's value would be. It also doesn't explicitly model fishing behavior in the way that economists would, so it has that similar weakness. And by design, it doesn't model these economic linkages that are relevant. And what I thought was really interesting about the methods is that it is similar to Professor Donahue's work in that it is a static kind of equilibrium comparison of the stock, and we're not looking at the path of dynamic recovery. Next. So when I was asked to kind of look over these analyses and explain the discrepancy, I think the big takeaway I had was that they actually are very similar, even though one's looking at the economy and one's really looking at the stock. And I don't think that these two reports are mutually exclusive. I think it's very possible that both of the findings could be true at the same time. Next. No one really asked, but because there's this kind of question is, what were the assumptions of Professor Donahue? Were they reasonable? I think they are very reasonable assumptions that he made. I would think that this addendum would have a big economic impact, at least in the short run. But what is probably the most important policy question is what would happen in the medium to long run. And to answer that question, you need to know about the recovery of the fishery and the recovery of the economy. And this kind of question is if how big the gains are and when they occur could have a really big impact. So if the biomass and the harvest increase as the technical committee predicts that they will, it could be the case that we would have net economic gains. However, if those gains are smaller or they just take a long time to accrue, it could actually be a net economic loss. Next. I wanted to throw out there that I did a little bit of a literature review when I was asked about these reports. And there's a few things that I think are really important and interesting to think about. So there was this work done by two UMaine professors in the 80s. They were looking at the expected benefits and costs of a similar type of policy, a little bit different in terms of the gauge change. That had a biological element as well as an economic analysis. I thought it was really interesting when I read it, the biological estimates in terms of how it would affect harvest. It seemed very similar to what was done more recently in 2021. The economics did not look so rosy, so they predicted that there would be gains eventually to harvest, but they would accrue too slowly, so it would be economically undesirable. I wouldn't put too much stock in that analysis though, because the methods don't meet today's best practice standards, so I wouldn't trust those numbers. I only was able to find this one other article looking at how changing minimum size affects harvests, but it was in a recreational fishing context. I'm sure there's more out there, particularly because this question seems very similar to policy changes in the sable fishery in Alaska, but I didn't have the references to kind of look over and help maybe contextualize what's going on here. But I think the most important thing, and both documents I looked at brought this up, there's this question, a lot of unanswered questions about the market of lobsters, particularly what's this relationship between size and price. It's well established by researchers that the size-price relationship is really important when you're thinking about management, so what the economic outcomes are. Most academic research focus on this positive relationship. So when big fish get higher prices per unit or per weight, and how that kind of plays into the policy of protecting large breeding females. But it sounds like in my experience over the past year and in these documents, there's this idea that for Maine lobsters, there might actually be a negative size price relationship. So smaller chick lobsters are getting a better price or more desirable. And I think that's really interesting because it could have really big impacts to the management, like what are the economic outcomes of management policies? So I think there's like a lot of really important questions that we don't have the answer to, which is limiting our ability to predict what the true economic cost of this policy will be. And that's it. That's all I have prepared, but I'm happy to answer additional questions. Can you go to the next slide? Of course, you can ask me now, but if anyone wants to reach out to me, my contact information is there.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. There was a lot to take in there. Your diagram for the non-economist in the room was probably appreciated because I think everybody is a non-economist in the room. So with that, I'd like to see if there's any questions from the board for Amanda. Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that last slide where you referred to Atchison and Reedman's predictions in the 80s about a measure increase, did you see what the data was from the 80s to the 90s after the last measure increase to follow that up?
Oh, interesting. I have not. So I only stumbled across that article the past like 2 weeks. And it is, I would say I'm not familiar with the formatting of that type of paper. So it really obscured a lot of their data and their methods, which is why I said I'm a little skeptical of it. But that's a really interesting question. I'm definitely gonna check it out to see if what they predicted manifested. I think the main problem is that their ex ante analysis, they were just looking at an increase up to, what was it, like the 88.9 or something. And I don't think that they would have told us what would have been that marginal benefit from just going from 81 to 83.
Follow up, Steve.
Follow up. We didn't make that full increase back then. We only went up
Right.
a little, but the stock was running just slightly ahead of its 20 million pound 100-year average. And in the 80s, we started approaching 30 and 40 million pounds in the 90s, 60 million pounds by 2000, and over 100 million pounds a few years ago. So I don't understand the prediction of an economic loss on a measure increase when the last time we did it, the data showed the otherwise.
So it gets down to this question about the price and how the price affects that measure of value, right? So they also found, like in the Atchison paper, the 80s, they predicted that the volume in weight would increase, but the number of individual lobsters caught would decrease. Net, they predicted that like harvest revenues would increase for Maine lobstermen after this policy took place. The problem is that they predicted losses for 5 years, and then only on the 6th year would the benefits come. So when you do the final cost benefit analysis, those initial years of losses were not made up for by the gains in their final year of their study. So when I'm suggesting there's this question about whether or not this would be good or bad for lobstermen, it's kind of under this idea that when you enforce this increase of size, that at least temporarily the harvests are going to go down, and they may go up 5-10 years from now, but that might not be sufficient to make up for the losses accrued in the short run, or it could compensate for it, right? Like your example of saying how we've just seen these steady increases over the past couple decades in our harvests. That is possible, My concern though is without kind of knowing how long it's going to take and what that recovery looks like, it's hard to know what the economic impact will be.
Thank you. Dan McKern.
Yes, thank you. I'm a little confused with some of the final conclusions that were made about there being a negative relationship between the size of lobsters and value, because every lobster market I've gone into, the least expensive lobster per pound is the chicken size lobster, chicken to £1.25. When you get up above £1.25, it's always an extra dollar per, at least per pound. So I'm skeptical that that relationship is a negative one.
I don't have any evidence to suggest it's one way or the other. I'm simply saying that in various papers and in some of these reports that I looked over, there was this suggestion that that there was this relationship, and I don't think that we know conclusively one way or another. I have heard concerns of people in the lobster fishery that I've talked to over the past year that because dealers have consolidated, that dealers are buying large volumes of lobster, and if they can't get the size they want from one group of harvesters, they may shift a lot more of their buying to another region. I think, do I have any evidence that that's true? No, I don't. I'm just saying that if this is true, if there is different features of the market, it could have bad consequences to this policy, so that there are a lot of kind of ways that this policy could get kind of distorted when we think about what the economic benefits could be. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. I think if there's one thing we've learned, trying to watch what's going on with lobster over the last few decades, is how dynamic this market is. So it's very hard to understand all of these relationships, I think, in the end. But this has been very informative. Is there any additional questions for Lindsay? Not seeing anything from a board perspective. Is there anything more the board would like to have looked at? Is there any information that we would like to pull from the TC, for instance, around these relationships to, I mean, they've already looked at the data along the potential loss of harvest, what would be made up in yield that year. We know those are estimates. Is there anything more we need there? Is there any refining of that data that we would like to see? Steve Tring.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd love to see the technical committee talk with economists and use some previous data, like the last time we went up on the measure, to see what the economic impact was the next year, 3 years, 4 years. Go that far back if they have to, but just to see beyond what we're seeing for spawning stock, biomass, and weight, just to see what the possible economic outcomes are of the change with history, not just raw data.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I was commenting to Caitlin earlier. It's like I'm not sure. And the economists in the TC would have to tell us, but I'm wondering if this is an apple to apple comparison, right? Because the resource was in such a different state then versus what we're seeing now. It may be something we could ask the TC to think about when they come together again, to think about, is there a relationship there that should be looked at from the last gauge change to this one, and make that comparison. But
May I make a quick comment?
Sure, Lindsay, go ahead.
I would just say, I think that the idea of looking at kind of historical evidence of how that increase affected harvest would be really great. I think it would also be interesting. It looked like in the methods described by the technical committee, I I'm not sure if it's possible, but it seems like they might be able to summarize kind of the path of recovery, the methods the reports that they provide say that they compare, they have the models run for 50 years to reach equilibrium, and then they do their analysis. So I don't know if it would be perfect, but it would be an interesting, it would be interesting to see how long the population takes before it reaches that new kind of level. So it's not a perfectly dynamic analysis, but it could give us a sense of how long it would take to achieve some of those outcomes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to staff. Tony?
I just want to note that the data sets that we have from the 80s versus the data sets that we have now are quite different. And I don't even know if we have a complete view of what landings data looked like in the 80s. So I just caution the board on the information that you're going to get back. And it may be helpful if we talk to our TC chair on the side and see what kind of work this will involve. Again, I'm still trying to keep that TC on track for the assessment, and what this will inform the board of in terms of its decision making. What action are we conforming for?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea, Tony. I think we've got some time here, right? So there's, depending on what happens with lawyer conversation today, there is a time frame that we have to work within. There's potentially a second gauge change that this could be also very informative for as well. So if there's no objection from the board, why don't we have Tony talk to the TC chair, Caitlin talk to the TC chair, figure out what that workload would be, and then bring that back to the board at the October meeting. Aloha, Mr. Reed.
Yeah, aloha to you. So in Miss Lindsay's effort, she said she did not take into account fishermen's behavior, which I'm assuming means at some point, if you're losing money, you may exit the fishery. So that's not accounted for. But Mr. Train is pointing out a study that was done some time ago. Is there any way to capture how many people fell out of the fishery due to a gauge change and the negative impact? And then of course, you know, fishermen don't usually go too often to work at Walmart, but there is a cost to drop out of the fishery and perhaps enter another fishery, which are these things that they produce maybe negative income in the short term for sure. But I'm just interested to know, how do you look at behavior in the effort?
Yeah.
Data.
So that I think the questions you asked are definitely answerable by economists, not by the style of modeling that Professor Donahue performs. So his analysis is like a macroeconomic methodology that kind of summarize aggregate behavior. So like everybody in the fishery, not particular fishermen. The type of modeling that I do, bioeconomic modeling, where you explicitly model economic decision makers, so fishermen, and you explicitly model the fish stocks. With those types of tools, which are kind of classified as microeconomic analysis, you are able to kind of look at entry and exit into a fishery. Changing effort could also be, you know, fishermen buying larger boats and trying to fish further from shore, or moving their effort around spatially. And so I think the point Michael Donahue refers to that kind of limitation of his model just to say that in defense of his assumption that it'll decrease landings 10%, effort changing in behavior can affect what that impact is. So again, it could be the case that 10% number is incorrect. And it's also, I think, as you say, it's a really important point. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, it does matter in the aggregate what happens, but it also matters what is happening to individual fishermen. Is it everyone just making a little less money, or are some fishermen forced out of the fishery completely? And it's something to think about. And unfortunately, the current analyses that are out there cannot comment to that.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. I'm going to take one more question. We've got to move on. Dennis?
Thank you. I will have a question, but I think we have to keep in mind why we're where we are. There's a reason why we proposed a gauge increase. And I think there was an understanding that there would be an initial loss of revenue. And a lot of what we did started in the state of Maine. And I don't disagree with anything that Professor Lindsay stated in her report. And I think it's beyond a perception of what's going on, as Representative Golden wrote us in his letter. So a question I would have, and I would direct it at Steve Train, a longtime lobsterman with generations of experience in his past. Are you willing to take a gauge increase for the long-term viability of your industry?
I mean, you're asking one member of a 5,000 member fishery down. So with all due respect and understanding exactly where Steve is in relationship to the coast of Maine and how this is impacting him versus mid-coast and down east, I think it's a very different answer depending on who you're talking with. Your point, though, Dennis, is well taken, that we are trying to be proactive in the face of changes that we're seeing in our juvenile assessments. And so I think that is certainly why we're here. I would also just remind the board that we are being proactive for the first time in how we act and how we work as a management board. And because of that, it does have challenges that relate to the economic health of our fishery. I think what I'd like to do now is move on with the agenda, but suggest that the issues that just came up that were raised by Eric Reed, along with the others, becomes a conversation between staff and the TC chair. We also know that we have a lot of data from sea sampling back into the 60s that potentially could come up, and maybe what needs to happen at some point is a conversation between Lindsay and the TC, because I think having that dialogue at that level would help answer some of these questions, right? These technical questions that are coming up, I think could be become part of a dialogue between the two entities. And then if that happens, they can bring that information back. Again, time is on our side here from a management perspective, depending on what happens later in this meeting, but we will have the ability to have this information coming in as we're trying to make determinations of the next steps with the management approach for lobster. Is that all right? Okay, seeing that, Lindsay, I want to thank you again for your time here today. It was very informative, and we appreciate the input that you've given the board. So with that, I'd like to move on to item number 7, which is review the discussions with Canada on complementary management measures. I'm going to ask Tony Kearns to give this report. Just for the reminder to the board, there has been a lot of conversations between the US and Canada based on Addendum 27, the impacts to both countries, the flow of lobster. And I had some very good conversations leading up to this meeting where the idea of having some managers as well as industry reps from zone councils and the LFAs in Canada come together, talk about what these things mean. And so Tony will give an overview of the meeting. And before she does, I just want to point out that the document that was in the supplemental materials was one that was submitted to Maine DMR. That information did not have all of the US reports that were given. Those were compiled. DFO Canada has not responded to that. So that is very much a draft document that is potentially going to change. Not a whole lot in it. If you had a chance to read it, that really is earth-shattering. It's all stuff that we've certainly discussed in the past, but I just want to make sure that was clear and on the record. So with that, Tony, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pat. And for those folks around the table that were at the meeting, if you have anything to add when I'm done, please do so. So as Pat said, we had some state staff and some U.S. lobster industry fishermen go up to Canada and meet with DFO staff and DFO fishermen from the maritime regions. And those maritime regions include the lobster fishing areas that start at the tip of Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, and they go to the Bay of Fundy and the US-Canada border in New Brunswick. And we presented an overview of what is going on in the United States in terms of the changes in the size limit in the Gulf of Maine. We provided information on what the status of our stock is doing, and then Canada provided an overview to us on the status of the maritime regions lobster fishing areas. And we found that their lobster fishing areas are all in a healthy condition. Uniquely, they both have stock assessments and management areas for each LFA. They'll either use a catch per unit effort to look at the status of the stock, or they'll have what they call a weight of evidence, which uses fishery independent surveys to give a status of their stock. And they're all in healthy conditions, but they are starting to see some similar trends in declines that we are seeing in the Gulf of Maine. And for Canada, in order to make changes in their management measures, they have harvest control rules with agreed upon decisions for actions to be taken if a stock falls below a healthy condition. Otherwise, any change in management has to come from the bottom up. So starting with the LFA, the industry making those decisions. And so in the case, since all of their areas are in healthy conditions, any changes that would be made now would need to start with those industry members. And so we provided the rationale of why we're making this change in the size limit for Area 1. And there were some of the LFA industry members that were open to an idea of a change in a size limit because they are also seeing some changes. And there are others that are a little bit more hesitant to want to make that change. And I think that's partially due to the fact that Canada approaches their management slightly differently than the United States does, in that they do have size limits, but they also have some seasons, and some areas have pretty restrictive seasons in place. And so that difference is meaningful to those fishermen. We also talked about what happens in the imports in the United States if the size limit comes into play, and whether current practices for product that is just moving through the country, so bonded product, meaning it is either being trucked or flown through the United States bound to another country, and whether that product would be subject to these new size limits or not. And I did speak with customs agents from NOAA, and currently bonded product is not subject to the US size restrictions, and they would not continue, and that would continue to happen if we do make a change in the size limit. That bonded product could still move through country and not be subject to the changes in the size limits. That bonded product needs to stay sealed. It cannot be manipulated in any way. As soon as it is transferred or manipulated, then it is no longer considered bonded product. And, I think at the end of the day, I think there is some interest in Canada to allow their industry to go home and talk to their LFAs, to continue discussions on whether or not they would be interested in either matching our size limit or coming closer to that size limit, but they need some more time to think about it. And then they definitely would not be able to make a change in the regulation prior to January 1, when our size limit comes into place. And so some of the things that came out in the discussion is, would you be able to delay, not delay that size limit increase or not? And we sort of left it on the table that we would come back to this board and have some discussions on what we may or may not be able to do. Is there anything else that Dan, Cherie, or Pat would want to add to that summary?
I think you really covered it. Dan, you have anything you want to add?
No, Tony, that's a great description, and it was an eye opener for me to hear the Canadian system when overfishing or overfish status isn't in play. It's a bottoms up. So really, I credit Pat for convening this meeting, but it was really an opportunity for us as managers to kind of get those fishermen together, the main zone council members, and the Canadian LFA, industry reps, lobster fishing areas. And there was a lot of good exchange. And I sensed there was some interest among the Canadian fishing representatives to consider this. But as you said, they couldn't possibly do it by the 1st of January. They would be convening a group called Marlac, which Pat, you can help me with what that is, but it's an annual meeting of the tribes of the fishing industry and DFO to talk about future management options. So if Canada were to follow suit with us, it would probably be in the early part, or sometime in 2025. Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Cherie, did you want to come to the public mic? We're gonna forgo the rule of 3 here for the table. Yeah, step away from the table, Ray. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead, Cherie.
Thank you. Dan and Tony really did cover it well. However, there was one thing I wanted to mention is that when asked how long it could take them to pull together regulations, we were informed that June 1st would be the time frame that if they were interested in doing this, that they could pull these regulations together.
Thanks, Cherie. I think this conversations with Canada, I think certainly have been reflected properly, and I think they were very positive. I think what Canada was feeling on the LFA side was the fact that they were this was being forced on them by the US. And there was certainly those type of concerns expressed around the table from the LFA reps that wanted to be able to have these conversations in a way that was going to be more informative in a time that allows them to be able to have really meaningful conversations with the harvesters. We had a lot of complaints from Canadian LFA reps that were there to say, our fishermen are fishing right now. They're not at that's why they're not at the table, which I pointed out that every fisherman from the US that was there gave up fishing to be there, right? So, and I think, frankly, a lot of it's culture, how things take place, how the meetings happen when their fisheries are happening. They have very few, it seems to me, very few of those kind of back and forths between harvesters and DFO. I do want to make sure it's clear for the table that we're talking about the LFAs in Canada that touch the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf of St. Lawrence, those LFAs around Newfoundland, Magdalen Islands in particular, those fisheries are going gangbusters like the Gulf of Maine fishery here was going back in the early 2000s up until 2016 where we set harvest records. So we're not expecting to see any change from the Gulf of St. Lawrence region. We're talking about the LFAs possibly around Southwest Nova Scotia and the Inter Bay of Fundy, making those type of considerations. We're expected that those will be meaningful conversations that are likely happening since that meeting through until the Marlac, which I can't remember what the acronym is either, and I'm not going to phone Tony. Tony's going to look in her notes. But that meeting will happen in September, And so we will certainly be more informed after that. Any questions from the board regarding these conversations with Canada? I would say from my standpoint, the idea of having, if we can see changes both in the US and Canada from a gauge perspective on both sides of the border, certainly that will be a much bigger conservation benefit for the Gulf of Maine. Dan?
Yeah, one other positive outcome of the meeting was I think there was a consensus that the US or our technical committee should have a regular check-in with the Canadian folks who are basically assessing the same stock on either side of the line. And I look forward to that in the future.
Yeah, I think what we saw, as Tony reported, very different management approaches using very similar, not even similar data sets, right? We're assessing juvenile, the side of the stock where they're using CPUEs and looking at landing. So very different approaches, but trying to achieve the same outcome. So I think having that science exchange is going to be really important. Jim Gilmore. Nice to see you, Jim.
Thanks, Chairman. Just years back when I know New York's fishery pretty much collapsed, whatever, but there was this issue, sort of this similar thing where all the lobsters were coming from Maine, and there was an issue about exactly what Tony had gone into. They had to be sealed, and there was tracking, but there was really not much of an issue for us because we didn't have a fishery, so we didn't have to do a lot of oversight of that. But in the north now, if that's going to be, you're going to have more of Canadian lobsters coming in, is that going to be an increased workload for you? Because now you could have different gauges, different markets, and now you're going to have to watch that a lot more closely than we had to. Just curious if you thought about that.
We thought a lot about it. I think that's what was one of the conversations around Addendum 30 and that we have coming up on the agenda and how we would deal with that. The conversation around bonded product, just so it's clear for non-border states, bonded product coming into through the United States is really driven by the fact that the country of origin, in this case being Canada, doesn't want to pay tariff and taxes at every country that it stops into its final destination. So it's bonded and sealed. Tony talked about having the conversation with the NOAA law enforcement agent that deals with that stuff. We do border inspections with NOAA OLE and Homeland Security. Maine Marine Patrol does. We're not looking at any shipment or any truck coming into the state or through the state of Maine or through the United States that is a sealed bonded truck. That is all done in the country of origin. It is all done based on the regulations of where that shipment is going. So the only shipments that we look at are ones that we know are going to come into the United States to make sure that they are consistent with our regs here. So, Dan.
Pat, I'm not sure you've been clear enough. The bonded product is heading out of country, typically to the airport.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, bonded product is leaving Canada, going to a U.S. airport, and then flying overseas. Yeah. Anything else on this item? Dan.
Well, we have two orders of business today that's coming up. One is Addendum 30, and the other is, I would like to start a discussion on doing what we've just discussed was a topic of conversation in Canada, which is a potential delay in the implementation of 27. So which would you rather take first? The delay? Okay. So I have a motion that I've shared with staff, and consistent with the mood and the theme and the details of our conversations, I'm interested in a small delay to the middle of the year in 2025 to implement the biological measures of Addendum 27. When I say the biological measures, what I mean is the gauge increase, as well as the standardization rules that were going to affect out of Cape Cod. But I'm not including the trap tag issues that Cherie and I both have to implement for 2025, which is no longer giving out 10%, and that's kind of mentioned in the body of the motion. So, by delaying this until July 1st, it certainly sends a signal to Canada that we want to minimize the impact on their fishery in the year 2025, because most of those fisheries finish by June 30th. And Pat, that was one of the reasons the Canadians were complaining, because they only had 2 days left of fishing because it was the last few days of June. And they just wanted to get their final days in, because then they pull the gear out for the rest of the year. So this would delay, for 6 months. And as far as the Massachusetts fishery goes, our fishery is closed in our state waters north of in Area 1 until the right whales leave, which is typically the first week of May. And the shed really doesn't kick in till the end of June. So I'm interested in delaying this until July 1st. And I'd be interested in hearing any other discussion, especially from my New Hampshire neighbors, since this Area 1 fishery is shared by the 3 states of Maine, Mass, and New Hampshire.
Dan, if you would you read?
Want me to read the motion?
Would you read the motion, and then we'll ask for a second.
Move to initiate an addendum to delay the biological measures implementation date of addendum 27 until July 1st, 2025. Specifically, biological measures under section 3.1 that created common size limits for state only and federal permit holders fishing in outer Cape Cod would be implemented effective July 1st, 2025, period. Similarly, management measures triggered under section 3.2 would be implemented by July 1st, 2025, starting with the year 1 measures and subsequent management measures, that is additional minimum size increase in Area 1 in year 3, vent size increase in Area 1 in year 4, maximum size reduction in Area 3 and outer Cape Cod would be implemented by July 1st of the calendar year for which they're required. Trap tag issuance regulations regarding the routine issuance of 10% additional trap tags in areas 3 and 1 above the trap limit or allocation would remain unchanged. So it would mean leaving the trap tag issuance intact and then creating a new addendum, which would alter the effective date of the biological measures.
Great. Thank you, Dan. We have a second. Steve Train, second. Discussion on the motion. Renee.
Dan, may I ask you a question about why July 1st? So in the meeting with Canada, as we heard that they said they could potentially move forward regulations by June 1st. June 1st also happens to coincide with lobster, one of the dates of lobster management, not the permit year, but the trap tag issuance year. So just curious on why not stick with a kind of known management date instead going to July 1st.
Renee, it's my impression that many of the Canadian fisheries remain open until June 30th. And so this would hold harmless, not the dealers per se, but would hold harmless the harvesters until that date, till the end of their season. Otherwise, you're asking them to make a significant change toward the tail end of their season. As far as our May 1st fishing year, or is it, we have a start date of fishing year and trap tag year, and one's May 1st, one's June 1st. That doesn't make any sense to me. So what's the difference to have a third start date? So I'm easy on that, but that was the rationale, is to try to get to the end of the Canadian harvest seasons that at least we know about. I am not an expert in all of the Canadian seasons, but I believe June 30th is a common closure date. Pat, am I right?
Yeah, I think based on the conversations with Canada, we heard from the majority of the LFAs there that their seasons were just ending, and we met at the end of June. So any additional questions, Chief Train?
Not a question, just the reason I seconded that, and I might have surprised some people because I know I've been advocating for this. We've definitely seen issues with the fishery. Is the dealers really messed up with this too, the processors especially, and they need more time to figure out what they're going to do, like as we wait for the Canadians to come on board, if they're going to. This will give them one more season of Canadian product in the spring where they don't have to worry about it. And then if the Canada doesn't come on board, at least they got another year to make a plan. I'm hoping Canada comes aboard.
Thank you, Steve. Any other questions from the board? I know there's a lot of people here that came a long way from the public. Is there anybody, member of the public, who would like to make a comment on this motion? Christian Porter. I'm gonna keep you guys to just a couple minutes, if you would, please. We won't time you, but Caitlin's got a big hook if you run too long.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, my name is Kristen Porter. I'm president of the Maine Lobstermen's Association. I fish out of Cutler, Maine. I just want to support this motion made by Commissioner McKernan. I guess there's a couple more things I want to add. I too was at the meeting in Canada. The meeting went very well. I think there is some support, for this from some of the fishermen in Canada, but I think there's also going to be some pushback. So I think we need to know what may happen if we all can do this together. And there's also some issues if they decide they don't. One of those issues is where I fish in the gray zone. We need to figure out how that's going to work. With two people fishing the same area on a different measure. The July 1st delay would definitely help us for next year because they move in there on their season ends on June 30th. So at least next spring we'd have the same measure for at least that amount of time till we can get this straightened out. The other issue I just want to say to that is kind of coast-wide is July 1st works better because you're just about to the molt. Springtime typically is a harder go, and you're fishing on stuff that's closer to the measure. So economic impact to fishermen would be better for a July 1st because you get the new molt coming rather than making a hard rub of it in the spring. So those are just the points I want to make that didn't get stated here, but I do think that July 1st is a better fit for everybody. And I know there's some the processing dealer issues that probably others will talk about, but thank you.
Thanks, Christian. Anybody else in public? Drew? Billable hours, Drew, so I'm going to leave you to a minute.
I work on flat rates, so don't worry about it. Drew Minkiewicz with the North American Lobster Alliance. The North American Lobster Alliance is the dealer and processors from Maine to Massachusetts. We support this motion. For the dealers, July 1st is an important date because of the Canadian fishery. The processors only process around 8 months of the year. April, May, and June, almost 100% of the lobsters that they process come from Canada because there's not enough supply in the United States from the fishery to supply them. It's a necessity. If they don't process those months, they are not a profitable company. They will go out of business. They need those months to get the product ready going into the summer season where people buy more lobsters. So this is crucial to allow for them to adjust and to see if the Canadians come along. Leaving aside whether or not addendum 30 is correct and whether or not 3 1/4 is the standard going forward, that's another discussion. But if the intent is to, at least at the state level, prohibit possession of anything at 3 1/4, this is critical for the processors. So we hope that you'll pass this and that we can continue to work collaboratively in addressing how to conserve the species and also conserve the dealers and processors in this process. I will note that at the Canadian meeting, the dealers and processors were not invited to the meeting. We do wish to be at the table to be part of this process. There's a lot of discussion about bonded product coming through the United States. to be very clear, that helps Canadian dealers. That is of no assistance to US-based dealers and processors, because once you possess in the United States, it's no longer bonded. That exemption goes away. So I find it interesting that out of the Canadian meeting, there were concerns about the Canadian dealers and what would happen from this, but there were not any proposals or prospects to addressing the issues facing US-based dealers and processors. So we want to be at the table to be part of the solution as we look to make sure this fishery continues to be viable going to the future, and also the business model of my clients remains viable. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Anybody else in the public? Jenny Olson, and then Dustin Delano. Can you hit the button, Jenny? There you go.
Gotcha. Thank you. I just wanted to say that this delay would give us some time to actually evaluate the number of Maine fishermen that are still fishing and have not left the fishery now that we have mandatory reporting and latency. I think it's important to see how that impacts the conservation in Maine. I also wanted to follow up on that bonded comment. I agree 100%. The unintended consequences of these sort of things are, if we don't have the size that the market's looking for, meaning the restaurants and wholesalers out there, then they're going to go to another source. And if they have that size, be it in Canada, then they can easily say, you know, to get these 10 crates of lobsters, you need to take these 10 crates of run, and that takes another sale away from Maine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate it. I think that question about harvesters leaving the fishery is something we do need to be keeping our eye on. I'm sure, I don't look at Jeff. I mean, I would think there is that from an assessment standpoint, is that effort side of the assessment. Are we looking at anything like that? Maine had 250 harvesters leave the fishery this year. We're going to see more going in the future. And that's certainly, and we're not talking just latent licenses. It's something we probably need to look at from all of the states from a Gulf of Maine perspective going forward. So, okay. Dustin Delano.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Dustin Delano from the New England Fishermen Stewardship Association. I'm also one of those people that left the fishery, unfortunately, but I just want to also give my support for the July 1st delay, and to express my appreciation to the 3 commissioners that went to Canada and initiated these conversations. You already received comments from us in your supplemental about why the July 1st date is crucial, but there are many benefits that have already been laid out here from harvesters and from the dealer perspective as well. But the hurdles with possession would be a problem with the June 1st implementation, and cause for a lot of these dealers to have to shift the way they do things in the middle of a very busy time. So we appreciate your consideration and hope that you'll move forward with the motion.
Great, thanks, Dustin. Dan McKernan, before I call the question.
Well, no, I have one other a question I'd like to pose before we take a vote. That would be, what can the timing be of enacting the rules? And I guess this is a question for the 3 states that have Area 1 fisheries, or maybe Rhode Island. I'd like to see it enacted on sooner than later, so that the gauge manufacturers really do produce the gauges, and this isn't perceived as a perpetual kicking of the can. So if you would allow me, after some just brief consensus about what our limitations are on rulemaking, what's the fastest we could get rules on our collective books, Pat?
From Maine's perspective, it takes us about 100 days to do regular rulemaking. I've not thought about it from our regulatory workload that we have right now, but we go through both. In the fall, we'll be doing our scallop in urchin regs, so it would come after that cycle. So we would probably start the process probably after the first year for implementation in the spring, late winter, early spring for Maine.
Is it possible for you to do it by the winter meeting, or is that too soon?
have them implemented by the winter meeting. We
Yeah.
would not have them implemented, not with the current regulatory workload that we've got in place right now.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely by the spring meeting though.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think if this motion passes, the board is going to need to talk about the timeline for developing and approving the addendum and public comment. Is it, draft at the annual meeting, final approval at the winter meeting, or is there something faster that this board has in mind? I mean, I think that's probably a conversation for after, we don't need to know it or have that conversation until we get an addendum teed up.
Yeah, that's a good placeholder for that. Thank you, Bob. Renee?
Yeah, I can just speak to our process. If it's through an ASMFC fishery management plan action, we can move very quickly. So we could have it on the books fairly quickly and have a public process.
I'm Allie Murphy, sorry. Right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to delay a vote here with a quick comment. I think I made similar comments last fall when a potential delay was discussed previously. I'm going to speak against this motion. I think we talked earlier in this discussion about how these measures were intended to be proactive, and every time we delay these measures, we limit their benefit. So we continue to urge the board to be as aggressive and proactive as possible in setting addendum 27 resiliency measures. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Allie. The last call for comments on the motion. Do we need a minute to caucus? We don't need a minute to caucus. I know we have one objected. Are there any other parties who object to this motion? Or nulls? If not, Tony, how do you want to handle that?
You can just ask if there's no objections, and if there's none, then
well, we have we have one objection. Well, okay. You need a caucus? Listen, we've been up since 3 a.m. Don't confuse me now. All those in favor of the motion on the board, please raise your right hand, or left hand, please raise your hand. 9. Hands down, please. All those opposed? 1. Any null votes? No null votes. Motion passes 9-1. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn back to Dan McCurran.
Can I ask about the timing of what staff perceive?
So I think the board has two options here. If the board is okay, this is a pretty simple document. All it is doing is saying we are going to delay the addendum. So we'll write up a statement of the problem, of sort of a summary of a little bit of the conversations that we've been having with Canada and why we are delaying the document, and then it'll have one option in the document. Staff can write that document up and email it out to this board, and this board can email approve the document, and then we can have it out for 30 days. Whether or not we need to do public hearings in person or not would potentially make a difference on whether or not we could bring then public comment back for final action in October. That is an extremely fast version of us doing something, and we would need your cooperation in terms of moving things along and getting information from you all very quickly. The other thing that we can do is wait to approve the document in October and then do a special meeting of the board in probably mid-December. And that would be still fast, but the other version so that we can get this done prior to January 1.
Thank you, Tony. Dan?
Pat, I would seek your guidance. Do you think if we fast track this and got it approved at the fall meeting, that would send the signal to Canada that they could proceed. Would that be a preferred time?
Yeah, I think so. I think I agree with that assessment, Dan, that I think it gives us the or it gives a good signal to Canada that we're doing this in good faith, for them to carry out some additional conversations with the LFAs, understanding that their timeframe is coming in September, but we'd be voting on it at the fall meeting. I say that I'd look back to staff to make sure. I like the concept of a very simple document here. I think we've just heard from members of the industry who are supportive of this approach. I would recommend that we just have one coast-wide webinar for a hearing, just to simplify this. And I don't know if there's any objections from the other states, but the simpler the better here. And then we would compile that information and bring it to the board in October. Bob.
Just one additional comment to what Tony said. If this board is a little bit uneasy about approving an addendum via email vote, we could do a webinar, a quick webinar of the board. They could go over it and, make any comments on edits and that sort of thing. So if that part is hanging anybody up, we could do a webinar.
Is that something we could determine on the fly, Bob? Yeah. That sound good to the board? Okay. Okay. So with that in mind, we will take the faster track from a time frame, simplified document, emailed to the board. Board would determine at that time whether we can do with a simple email vote and dispense with that. And then we would schedule a single webinar, coast-wide webinar, to garner public comments on the document with a final review and vote at the annual meeting in October. Seeing all nods around the table. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Dan, do you have anything else on this side? No, nothing. Okay. I'm going to wait for my computer to wake up. Okay. Moving right along, we're going to go to item number 8, which is consider addendum 30 on the Mitchell provisions for final approval. This is a final action on this document. So I'm going to give the floor over to Caitlin for an update, reviewing the options and the public comment summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is consideration of Lobster Draft Addendum 30, which is on the foreign import minimum size recommendation that would come from the Commission. And just a quick reminder on the timeline of the development of this document. The board initiated the addendum back in January of 2024, then approved it for public comment in March. And okay, so I'm going to keep going while she pulls that up. So the document was approved for public comment in March, and then the public comment period and hearings were held from March until early June. And at this meeting, the board is reviewing the public comments and considering the addendum for final approval. And then if this addendum is approved, the Commission's recommendations would be forwarded to NOAA Fisheries. So as a reminder, the board initiated draft addendum 30 to address how gauge size changes like those triggered by addendum 27 would affect foreign imports of live American lobster. So as we've discussed last fall, the trigger index established in addendum 27 declined by over 35% from the reference period, which triggered the implementation of a series of management measures to protect the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank spawning stock biomass. And the first of those measures is the gauge increase in LMA1, and then to allow more time to communicate with Canada about those management measures between the two countries, the implementation date was delayed to January 1st, 2025. So this, I'll skip the table since it's not showing, but the issue of imported lobster is related to the Mitchell provision of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which prohibits the import and sale of lobsters smaller than the minimum possession size in effect under the Commission's FMP. The Mitchell provision was intended to prevent smaller lobster than what the U.S. industry could catch from coming into the U.S. market. So given that the 2025 and 2027 changes in minimum size for LMA1 would also change the minimum size for lobster entering the U.S. under the Mitchell provision. And the purpose of draft addendum 30 is just to clarify the Commission's intention regarding the LMA, which would be 3.5, and then 3 3/8 inches in 2027. And this is consistent with the intent of the provision to limit live lobster imports into the U.S. to be no smaller than what the U.S. industry can legally land. And I'm going to pause because I do, okay, she has it up, right? Can you go to the public comments? All right, so I'm going to go through the public comment summary. So as I mentioned, our public comment period for Addendum 30 was in March to early June. And during that time, we held 2 virtual public hearings. And the combined public attendance at those 2 hearings was 35 individuals, although some of those folks attended both hearings. At the hearings, 5 public comments were provided. And then a total of 117 written comments were received as well, including 13 letters from organizations and the remainder from individual stakeholders. The table on the bottom is giving an overview of the support or opposition to the proposed action in Addendum 30. So as you can see, a significant number of comments did not address the addendum directly, and those are counted in a separate other category. Of the comments in support for Addendum 30, the reasons given were 1, that allowing imports to be smaller than the new gauge size would increase the negative economic impacts to harvesters, and 2, that if imports are not handled as recommended in Addendum 30, then U.S. lobstermen would be put at a huge disadvantage and would lose money and be put out of business. The comments that opposed Addendum 30 generally focused on these 3 issues. So first, the negative impacts to the processors that would result from restricting imports to the U.S. minimum size in effect. Some examples were that it would disincentivize processors from operating in the U.S., that the Canadian chick lobsters are what keep those U.S. processors going before the U.S. lobster season can supply them. And they estimated a 20 million pound reduction in Canadian lobster imports and a loss of $128 million for the domestic industry. Comments also mentioned concerns about supply chain disruptions and noted that Canadian dealers don't have sufficient workforce and facilities to physically grade large volumes of lobster by gauge size. Some general comments were submitted by Canada. These raised the question of how this action considers mutual obligations under trade agreements between the US and Canada, as well as questions related to the necessity of the action, how achievement of the objectives will be measured, what alternatives have been considered, and the relevance of this action for lobsters traveling in bond, which we've discussed. The other comments submitted were largely about the LCMA 1 gauge increase that was triggered by Addendum 27 and asked for that measure to be canceled or postponed. Some of those comments also mentioned that trap limits should be considered instead, larger lobster should be protected rather than smaller ones, and that the US and Canada should have the same minimum gauge size. So with that, we have the final approval of Addendum 30 up for board consideration today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. Any questions for Caitlin? Seeing no questions for Caitlin. What is the pleasure of the board? Doug Grout.
I'd like to make a motion to approve draft Addendum 30 today.
I have a motion by Doug Grout, second by Dan McKernan. Doug or Dan, you would like to give any additional rationale?
Not anything additional other than I think it's important, and that I think it's something that in the original document is what we intended, the original Amendment 27. So.
All right. Kate, go ahead, Kate.
I just wanted to clarify if your intent was to have it be effective today. And if so, can you read it into the record again, because we added a word.
Be glad to move to approve draft Addendum 30 effective today. Not to, thank you.
Great. Dan McKernan.
Yeah, the only comment I'd like to make is based on the conversation we had earlier as a board about the so-called bonded product. And it's my understanding bonded product, as you mentioned, is coming into the country, but heading out of the country, going to a foreign country, overseas, capitalizing on Logan Airport primarily, I guess, that wouldn't be affected by this. As was mentioned by Tony, it's for product that comes in that is intended to be commingled and opened, et cetera.
Eric Reed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of rules with bonded product. You can't just take a bonded truck and drive up to Southwest Airlines and unload it. You have to go through a bonded warehouse, an agent that is bonded. There is a lot of rules, a lot of safeguards, I guess is what I should say. I'm not worried about that in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Eric. Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Judging by the last vote we made, that's going to actually change our sizes in July of 25. Is there a rush to implement this today, or could we put the same effective date on it? And the reason I ask is because we've made changes in the last 6 months, and I don't know if we want to have to change a lot of things all at once.
Thanks, Steve. Tony.
Steve, it's more, it doesn't make the change for the size limit to be effective today. It's just showing our intention of if and when size limits change, that it is our intention that the Mitchell provision pertains to those changes in size limit. So it's just stating our intention of what that size limit change means. So I think it's good that people understand what our intention is. And so making that known to everybody provides clarity for individuals when they're trying to understand how these rules may or may not apply to them in the future. So that would be the rationale of why you would have it effective today.
Thank you.
Good. Additional comments or questions from the board? Not seeing any. I'd like to quickly go to the public because I know we've got people here who've traveled to speak on this issue. The first on the list is Bob Blaze from East Coast Seafood.
Thank you. Yes, Bob Blaze, East Coast Seafood. We have been in the lobster business since our inception in 1981. We own a Canadian lobster company. We're a Maine dealer. We're a Mass dealer. We're a Massachusetts lobster processor. So we cover all the bases here. And the restrictions that we're imposing here with Amendment 30 is going to reduce the number of lobsters coming through New England dealers and New England processors. It's going to inhibit our ability to stay in the processing business in the United States. We're only processing for 8 months as it is. We rely on Canadian lobsters when there are no domestic lobsters available. Those months are April, May, June, or May and June primarily. And then at the end of the year, from the latter part of November into December. So by reducing, by limiting us on what we can bring into the country, limits what we can process, and may not be beneficial to process at all to keep all that property, plant, and equipment without any activities on that end of it.
Thank you, Bob. Bob, I'm gonna have to keep people to 1 minute because we've already got public comment on this. So I'm gonna let you just wrap it up if you would, please.
Okay. So I don't understand how we're protecting Maine, the Canadian fishery, and with the bonded plan of being able to bring product through the country and not go through dealers. It should be allowed to bring any size lobsters into the country. I don't agree with the Mitchell bill. And since then, we've had NAFTA and USMCA, and I believe that those trade practices now really makes the possibility that the Mitchell bill conflicts with the current USMCA.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Thank you for your comments. Anybody else on this topic? See, Drew. Again, Drew, we're keeping everybody to 1 minute on this one.
Got you. Drew Minkiewicz with North American Lobster Alliance again. Just want to say in the summary of the comments, it was not noted that we commented that 3¼ inches is still the minimum size in effect in the lobster management plan. So under the Mitchell provision, it's still 3¼ inches is the plan. So this is an unnecessary action. And also just looking at the comments 4, I would disagree with the factual accuracy of the comments supporting addendum 30. And I would also notice that there's no conservation benefit to what you're doing here. This is not helping the lobster fishery, the conservation of lobster in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. I'm going to turn to Tony. You got a quick comment?
Just to clarify for the record, the coast-wide minimum size is a floor in which no LCMA may go below. It is not a size limit that any LCMA would have in effect at the time the measures change. And so in the Mitchell provision, it says in effect in the commission's plan, and the size limits are done via the each LCMA. So the coast-wide floor doesn't apply to the Mitchell provision.
Good. Thank you, Tony. Back to the board. Any additional comments? Seeing none, do we have any opposition to this motion? Oh, this is final action. We have to have a vote. We have to have is it a roll call vote, Tony?
We can have states raise their hand and I can just call out the
You'll
states.
read the names. Okay, great. All those in favor of the motion that is on the board, please raise your hand.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire.
Great. Any no votes?
Nope.
Nulls, abstentions?
No fisheries.
Great. Motion passes 9-0-0-1, I believe was 10. Do you have 10? Okay. Motion passes. Do we need any? Okay. That concludes the conversations and final action around addendum 30. We're going to move right along to item number 9, which is a vessel tracking working group report. So Caitlin is going to give an update on the work group. And then considering the time, I'm going to have a couple comments about maybe the next steps here with this approach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the board task that the vessel tracking work group was responding to was to task the addendum 30 vessel tracking implementation group with input from the LEC. Oh, yeah, okay. Now my computer's frozen. 1 moment. The computers are tired. Okay, so this was in response to industry raising concerns about privacy related to the addendum 29 requirement for the tracking devices to be on at all times. So the board task specified that the work group should investigate modifications to the 24/7 vessel tracking requirement, which still ensure monitoring of fishing activity while acknowledging that fishermen also use their boats for non-fishing reasons or other personal reasons. And the task included getting input from the LEC and reviewing the existing processes for when VMS devices can be turned off. So I'll start off with the VMS processes. The important takeaways that the work group found are summarized here on this slide. The first thing to note is that the VMS regulations for Atlantic fisheries require VMS devices to be on and collecting data 24 hours a day unless they're authorized to power down. And exemptions are only given to allow a device to power down in specific circumstances. And those are when the vessel will be out of the water for over 72 hours, when the vessel signs out of the VMS program for 30 or more than 30 consecutive days, and does not move from its mooring until that VMS device is turned back on. And then if the vessel is issued a limited access general category scallop permit, is not in possession of scallops, is tied to its permanent mooring and has notified NIMS of the power down. The regulations also require a letter of authorization from NIMS to be issued to the vessel owner, and that must be applied for via written request and provide information to NIMS, including the vessel location. The work group also noted the following additional information related to VMS. First, it clarified that VMS users can declare out of the fishery, but that does not mean the VMS device stops collecting tracking data. And additionally, VMS devices are capable of geofencing, and it is currently used in some cases to change the ping rate when a vessel enters or leaves specific areas. But geofencing is not ever used to automatically turn off a VMS device in certain areas. And then lastly, the fastest ping rate for VMS devices is 1 ping every 5 minutes, and the national VMS regulations currently do not allow for a faster ping rate. So moving on to the work group's suggestions for possible modifications in response to their task. There were 2 main strategies the work group discussed. The first is the use of geofencing, which involves defining an area or boundary that when crossed, it would trigger an automatic change to the device ping rate. The second strategy would be what the work group called a snooze function, and this would be a process for setting a device to not collect spatial data for a predetermined period of time. So with the geofencing strategy, the board would need to define the areas where the ping rate would be different than the 1 per minute rate that's in addendum 29. It would also need to define what that different ping rate would be, for example, 1 per day or something else. And a big issue with this strategy is that the currently approved devices are not all capable of geofencing. So this wasn't something that was required in addendum 29 or when our request for proposals was released. Specifically, the Viatrax devices, which make up the majority of devices in the non-main fleet, cannot use geofencing right now. And another concern with this is that in order to use geofencing, you need cell phone service to register when a vessel crosses cell service, not cell phone service, to register when that vessel crosses its defined boundary and adjust the ping rate at that time. But cell service is not available everywhere these vessels would be going. And so that would mean the devices would need to use satellite rather than cellular to use this approach. And that would be a high cost with that 1 minute ping rate. The other approach of implementing a snooze function would require establishing a process where a web form would be submitted to request a temporary snooze of a particular device during a period of non-fishing activity that is specified. And then if that request is approved, the device would stop collecting data for a period of time defined previously in the form. And after that period of time, it would automatically wake back up and resume data collection. Of the currently approved devices, Viatrax and Particle are capable of doing something like this, but it would increase the cost to have this function because of the development fees and increased subscription fees. And additionally, this type of process would require states and/or the vendors to process and approve snooze requests and disable the devices. One plus side that was discussed about this strategy is that it would create a record of every time a device is snoozed, and that could help mitigate abuse of the function by bad actors. So both of these approaches come with some concerns about data loss, but geofencing more so than snoozing. With geofencing, we would lose data on fishing effort in the areas where the ping rate would be slowed down. So for example, if this approach were implemented and a boundary were set for the devices to start pinging at the 1 minute ping rate once they cross the 3 mile line, for example, then data for fishing activity inside the 3 mile line would be lost. And as discussed in addendum 29, the ping rate of 1 per minute was selected because that's the rate that allows us to be able to identify fishing effort, whereas slower ping rates than that aren't as capable of doing that. But because a significant number of lobster trips do occur in state waters, this would be a big loss of data. Additionally, it might create some challenges for trips that occur in both state and federal waters if we were to only have a track for part of a trip. And with the snooze function, if it's used correctly, so only when a vessel is not fishing, then there shouldn't be too much data loss, but there is a chance of fishing activity not being captured while a device is snoozed. As requested, the working group got input from the LEC Law Enforcement Committee on these ideas. And one thing the LEC noted was that tracking has helped to reduce the misuse of trap tags. So not having tracking in state waters would create a loophole there. With regard to geofencing, the LEC was concerned that it would be easier to cheat inside the defined boundary, and that because they're able to get quicker access to spatial data where cell service is available, which is more of the inshore area, it could potentially slow down investigations of already suspected vessels. In general, the LEC commented that the vessel operators should not be allowed or able to turn devices on or off themselves. And if that were the case, it would be extremely difficult to enforce the requirements because law enforcement wouldn't really be able to determine whether a device was purposely turned off or if it failed. And lastly, there was a discussion about defining what are fishing versus non-fishing trips. And the LEC and the work group both agreed that with either of these strategies, it would be really critical to implement clear rules around non-fishing trips, such as prohibiting any bait, gear, or lobster being on board during those non-fishing trips. The work group had a few additional things for the board to consider as well. So one is that since tracking was implemented, the states have seen improvement in trip reporting with fewer errors in those reports. Second, they noted that if the board pursues this further, it could make it so permit holders could have a choice about whether to get a new device or upgrade to a device that's capable of one of these strategies, but not require everybody to get a new device if they don't want to. And then lastly, they noted that some of the currently approved companies would have to make some significant investments to modify their devices to be able to use satellite service. And because the devices have already been purchased, there might not be a huge financial incentive to pursue those modifications, and that could potentially limit the availability of devices that would be able to accomplish these strategies. And that's all I have, so I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. Any questions for Caitlin? Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Caitlin. So geofencing thing looks a little more complicated, but the snooze option, say somebody like me that lives on an island and I'm not fishing on Sundays. You have to call in Sunday morning and say, I don't want my tracker. I want it to be snoozed on Sundays because we're going boating. Can I do that once a year and say Sundays I'm not fishing, or is that every time you go?
The way the work group discussed it, it would be a one-time request every time you want to snooze the device. And it would be a web form. It wouldn't be like calling in and saying, I want my device to be snoozed.
And you have to call and tell them how long you want this snoozed, or, I mean, it still is, you know, for something that is used like an SUV for about half the fishermen in the state of Maine, you know, it's like a plumber's van or electrician's van. You use it for everything, not just when you're working. It seems onerous.
Those were the two things the work group came up with that would be viable things that our devices could do.
Any other questions? I'm gonna phone a friend. Kurt Blanchard, can you come to the table? Kurt, I'm just, so my question that I keep rumbling around here in my head is just kind of prima facie evidence as far as being on and off, or literally being on or off the boat, the tracker being on or off the boat. Is that something that could simplify an enforcement approach here? If it's not on the boat, or if it's not on, it's prima facie evidence of a violation.
I'm not clear on what you're asking. Are you asking if the device is on the boat or the device is turned on while on the boat?
Could be either. Could be either.
Currently, the way it's worded now, that would be prima facie evidence of a violation.
Right. So I'm thinking about Steve's example where on a Sunday, non-fishing day in the state of Maine, he's using his boat to go into town to get groceries or whatever. he just removes it. I mean, we'd obviously have to have language change within the plan. We'd have to have regulatory language associated with it. But I think what I'm concerned about is if we were going to go in this direction, having something so onerous from a regulatory standpoint for an agency to have somebody that takes that call every time the boat isn't going to be used for fishing. I'm looking for something simpler from an enforcement standpoint. So if somebody's going to be on their boat and they are seen in the act of fishing, and that tracker is either not turned on or not on, depending on the approach that we've taken, that would be prima facie evidence of a violation.
So that goes to the clear defining what fishing activity would be, or what you would consider the activity to be when it would have to be on. Yeah. And that's clear. As long as, from a law enforcement perspective, as long as we can clearly define when the activity is taking place and when that should be on, we can support that. Again, the reality of it is, and we had this discussion on the working group, is the tracking by law enforcement of fishermen moving around harbors and using the boat for personal use. The reality of that happening is pretty minute. I can't see where or how that would be beneficial to the supporting the cause of why we have this for this industry, or for the fishing activity. You know.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I think what you're getting at is kind of with that, the idea of if you defined fishing, what that fishing activity is. We do that with menhaden, with power block and net, and those things have to be on board your on a vessel if you're going to be in possession of fish, right? So, you know, you've got bait, you've got gear, you're in the process of hauling gear, right? How would you define that? And just trying to think of a more simpler approach than having to make a phone call. So I won't put you on the spot anymore, but I just wanted to get your input on that on the record. I think this is I think from a board perspective, we've got a working group that's done a lot of work here. It's given us, I think, some very valuable advice on geofencing and potentially other approaches. What I would recommend is that we kind of absorb this information and add this to the next agenda item, the next board meeting in the fall at the annual meeting for kind of further discussion and refinement. And maybe the law enforcement committee could talk about the defining of the fishery so it would be a potential simple approach if the board wanted to go in that direction. So, Dan McKernan.
Yeah, Pat, if you also could define the burden. It's not clear to me who the fisherman is calling. Is the fisherman calling the company that sold them the device, or is it calling someone at DMR or a third party? So that's not clear to me based on this discussion. So if more could come later on that, it'd be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's valid, Dan. I think, you know, I always look at it as it's our regulation, so we would have to give that authority to be able to move away from that regulation for a period of time. So, Bob, you.
I thought we were going to give Caitlin's cell phone number, but that's apparently not. But still for all the phone calls. But one of the issues that's tricky here is there's 4 or 5 manufacturers, and they all have different capabilities, and some of the devices don't even have a physical on-off switch. And if you remove them from the hardwired power on the vessel, they've got a battery backup, so they keep recording things. So, you know, I think these are unique issues with each different device that we kind of have to work through one by one. But probably to your point of let's, you know, work group did a lot of good work. Let's think about it a little bit. And if there's additional questions and some of these unique features of the different devices, we have to kind of work through some of these questions as well. You're off.
Yeah, I think this is a complicated issue. We have a standing case in front of a federal judge in Maine. We don't know the direction that judge is going to go, right? So this could be something that's going to have to be, depending on the action of that judge, decision of that judge could change the trajectory and the speed at which we have to act. or it may be the opposite, right? We may be found completely compliant. But at the end of the day, I think we've passed a motion to look at these issues. We've got good information on the table. I think there's some defining that potentially could be done that helps us get around the fact that we've got 4 or 5 devices that we have to deal with. I think the other question becomes, we've had, as we have implemented our rule in Maine, we have had staff call fishermen to say, hey, your device isn't on. And if you look at that device, it's not that they were being malicious, it's just that the fuse is blown, something happened, and it's on battery and it's pinging every 6 hours. So all you get is a spot on a chart every 6 hours. How much of an invasion of privacy is that? Right? I mean, those are the kind of things that I start to think about as I start thinking about how we would deal with this and how we want to look at it going forward. So if there's no objection, what I'd like to do is let's take this information, think about it a little bit, and then add it to the next agenda, the agenda for the fall meeting. And Tony, hopefully won't disagree with that.
No, I don't disagree. And when you're thinking about it, let's try to keep in mind like how we can stay accountable and not create loopholes within the fishery, because I think that we talked about that with the work group as well as enforcement, and that's really important. And that by creating loophole, if we do create loopholes, that could be actually more administrative burden on your staff than these call-ins potentially. Who knows? I think it depends on how many people actually want to utilize this news function. But the other part is that I hope we keep an open mind in the sense that, is it possible that we could just allow for a device that meets these needs, but still let these individuals who are fine with having the 24/7 tracker continue on? Because as Caitlin said, some of these devices we're not even sure have the capability of getting to this point at all. And so, and that we have, many thousands of dollars invested in this already. And for those individuals that are fine with these devices, why would we make them change, spend more dollars on new devices when they're okay with what they have?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Tony. I think those are really good points. Renee Zobel.
Yeah, Tony essentially just took the words out of my mouth. A lot of money is spent on these devices that were approved devices by the addendum. They were the intent of the addendum to be low-cost cellular devices that did the job. So I just would caution moving forward in a way that doesn't allow that big investment, in some cases by the federal government and their allocation to this industry to be able to meet that mandate.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. I appreciate that comment. Anybody want a last word on this issue? Caitlin, are you going to give your phone number out?
Staff would just like to clarify if there's any work that we need to do on our end between now and October, or are the board members just going to think about this and come back in October and have a discussion?
My intent, unless the board has some additional tasking for staff, my intent was that we just think about it, with the exception of maybe law enforcement thinking about potential definitions of fishing if we were going to have kind of that prima facie approach to whether it's on or off. But other than that, I didn't have any additional tasking. So if we're all set on that, okay, moving right on. Is there any other business to be brought before this board? Because I am the only thing standing in the way of dinner, or as we say in Maine, supper. All right, seeing none, motion to adjourn. I hear it all around. Thank you very much.